Hello, I'm Eileen Gonzalez,
And my name is Luis Rubio.
and today we are going to be presenting the effects of climate change and the rising of sea levels, the causes and effects of those, and what we're doing internationally to help combat that.
So we decided to combine our Padlets in order to make a more solid presentation. And I feel like this really gives you a detailed overview of what climate change is, but it also dives deep into a single effect of climate change. So what is climate change? That's the question of the hour, right? So climate change refers to the long-term shifts in temperature and weather patterns. So these patterns are typically natural, but it appears to be since the 1800s due to the rise of industrialization, which included the locomotive and steam engines. That us human activity started inputting too much greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, therefore disrupting these patterns. And we have finally reached a point in our history where it's really the effects are, we have to pay dividends to the effects of those climate changes.
So one of the most apparent effects of climate change right now is the rising of sea levels. Since 1880, they have risen 8 to 9 inches, which is a new record high. And high tide flooding is now 300 to more than 900 more frequent than it was 50 years ago. Due to climate change and the temperatures rising, one of the most apparent things that we're noticing is the melting of glaciers around the world. So two of the main contributors to rising sea levels is the Greenland ice sheet and the Antarctic ice sheet. And the melting of the Greenland and Arctic ice sheets are the largest contributors to global rising sea levels. The article states that the Greenland ice sheet is disapproving as much as 4 times faster in 2003 and is already contributing to 20% of current sea level rise.
So you might think, rising sea levels, whatever, how does it affect me? But if you think about it, this means every city along the coast, becomes vulnerable to the floodings, and we don't even have the right infrastructure to counterattack these floodings. And if the cities on the coast are flooding, what does that mean? Migration. So that means it's now your problem too. And that's the funny thing with climate change. And I feel like that's why it's escalated this far, is because we don't feel the effects immediately, yet in 10, 20 years, those effects are going to be right in our face. And at that point, they're going to be irreversible. And going back to what she was saying about the small countries, developing nations, I feel like they have got the worst part of the deal, because they now have to cooperate to reverse the effects of climate change when they were not industrializing like the wealthy nations. So now the wealthy nations are stuck with a pocket full of cash. And now they're saying, yes, let's reverse the effects. But the developing nations are saying, hey, you know what? We didn't even get a piece of the pie, and we still have to help you clean up the mess you made.
So in an article done by NASA, it clearly states that sea levels on the West Coast have risen at a steadily pace. And in a 2009 study, it found that sea levels could displace 13 million Americans by the 22nd century.
Now we get to the part of what is the role of an IGO in the climate change fight. So this actually varies. We decided to include this article in our Padlets because it serves as an example that each organization has different roles in the climate change issue. So for example, if you click the article on the Padlet, this specific organization was, and I quote, created to provide policymakers with regular scientific assessments on climate change. So this organization is not very hands-on with the climate change. Yeah, it's essential at the same time, because it provides the scientific information that the other organizations use. So it's almost like a joint effort.
And one of the doctrines that I came about was the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea, and it was signed and everything on December 10th, 1982. It is known as the Constitution of the Oceans. And in this doctrine, there are laws and rules set in place to help protect the oceans and marine life and their surrounding areas. Here's a little about that. This is kind of just an overview of that doctrine and what it states and what it does.
Now that we have discussed a few IGOs and other organizations who are on the front lines in the war against climate change, it is also notably important to mention the Paris Agreement, which is a legally binding international treaty, and it was put in place in order to combat climate change or address the issues regarding climate change. So this is like the first true treaty in which 196 nations agreed and ratified that they would set global standards in order to reduce these climate change effects.
And this is said to be like the most important and the most well-known treaty among the globe. One of those monumental moments that was kind of came abroad in that was that every country agreed to work together to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees and to aim for 1.5 degrees in order to adapt to impacts of climate changing and to make money available to deliver on these aims.
So that is where the grievances arose, because not every country, and specifically Russia,
The United States, Australia, China.
so they were not able to keep these guidelines. So aside from that, the Paris Agreement it set out that every 5 years countries must set out increasingly ambitious climate action. So this is why the COP26 was taking place, so everybody could outline their new plans. But the conference got delayed a year due to the COVID-19 pandemic. But basically, to sum up what happened at COP26, that's why we chose to add this article to our Padlet, because it's a direct source, like straight from the UK COP26 website. So basically, what this concluded in, you want to talk about that, Amy?
Is that in Glasgow, all countries were agreeing to the Glasgow Climate Pact to keep 1.5 Celsius alive and finalize the outstanding elements of the Paris Agreement. So it's basically kind of just adding the attributes to the Paris Agreement and taking action on what was already agreed on.
So you could basically say, it says the Glasgow Climate Pact combined with increased ambition and action from countries, it meant that 1.5 remains in sight and scales up in action. But I mean, it's safe to say that it didn't really, introduce any new guidelines into the agreement. They just agreed to keep that 1.5 Celsius alive.
Yes. So what I have learned from this entire research is that rising sea levels is something that has been going on for years on end, and the dangers of it have steadily increased since time has gone by. And what we can do as a nation and internationally is combat climate change and work together, because in reality, nothing's really going to be solved if we don't work together as a unification of one. And I think right now the biggest constraint and challenge that we're facing is not everyone is working together, and that's why we're still having these ongoing issues and effects of climate change.
So to add on to what she was discussing about the constraints of properly addressing climate change, over the course of this research, I realized that there's like a vast diversity of nations all over the globe, and each nation has its own individual problems, and like they obviously have their best interests in mind. So when it comes to coming together and agreeing on certain guidelines and certain standards to follow, it's hard because everybody has their own set of natural resources, their own set of geographic locations. So it's a difficult problem to tackle, but we're at a point in history where it's inevitable that this issue is only going to get worse. So we really have to come together and work some guidelines that benefit all of us. So going into that geographic location a little bit more specifically, some nations are having more difficult to comply with the mandates. And a perfect example of this is Russia, because its main product of the economy is natural gas. And it happens to be unique to them because of its geographic location. So there's a clear example of a country, a superpower, who is coming to the summits and agreeing to all the guidelines, yet they're finding it difficult to meet the standards required.
And ways that people, just literally anyone, can help combat this is like in their day-to-day lives. They can change the kind of bulbs they're using. They could simply unplug items that aren't in use, or they could join committees and get involved in educating and doing what they have to do, or doing their part in combating climate change.
So in order to avoid boring you guys, we didn't dive in too deep into any of these topics, because these topics could go on for days, but we hope that you could take a look at our Padlets and get an idea of the issues we're trying to address.
Yes. So thank you.
Thank you so much for your time.